so we talked about the interpretive approach. The next approach, which is sort of the opposite, is the materialist approach. And so materialist anthropologists study culture. They don't focus on worldview driving behavior. Rather, their focus is on the material forces. So they would say the material forces drive the cultural system. Material, the word in our culture has different meanings. The way you want to think about it in this context is tangible. The environment, the economy, the tools you use to exploit resources in your environment. These are the material forces. So they include things like subsistence patterns. What is the economy or the subsistence of a particular culture? Are they fishers? Are they farmers? Are they horticulturalists, sort of gardening? Are they hunter-gatherers? Do they work in a wage industrial society like us? So how do they make a living in their environment? What's their subsistence like? Also, the technology is one of the material forces. What types of tools do they use to exploit resources in their environment? Is it simple digging sticks? Is it complex machinery? What's the tools and also the knowledge that accompany those tools to, again, allow people to live in their environments? And lastly, it also includes economic patterns or economic relations. Don't let this throw you off. What we mean by that is how is the economy set up? Does sort of everyone have a say in how it works? Like hunter-gatherers often do. We'll look at it in a second. Or is it a handful of people that really control the policies and the structure of the system that affects all of us? Is it just a few people that control that? So who sort of controls the relations of production? Some people, all the people, what's that look like? And so in the materialist approach, the key objective is understand what are the material forces? What's the subsistence, the technology, and who controls those, right? What are the relations of production? And then explain the rest of the cultural system in terms of the material forces. And if this, again, if this is sort of vague, that's okay. We're gonna go through some examples, hang some flesh on the bones. So here you can visualize a summary of the materialist approach and also the interpretive approach. So recall the interpretivist focus at the top of our pyramid, looking at worldview, how people think about things, language, religion, ideology, ritual. How does this drive behavior and shape the society, the way it's organized? Materialists, on the other hand, start on the other side of the pyramid. And so they would say, it's not worldview that you focus on to understand what shapes the culture. Materialists would say the most important driving force in what shapes a society is people needing to meet their basic needs in their environments. Food, shelter, water, whatever that is, reproduction. And so the way in which people meet their basic needs in their environment through the material forces, this is most important, and this is what will drive all else, shape the rest of the social organization, the population size, the way people are organized. Are they equal? Are they unequal? Okay, notice that really the environment is at sort of the bottom of our pyramid. And so the environment that one inhabits presents and precludes certain opportunities for exploitation. For example, you're not going to be a fisher in the middle of the desert, right? It's not an option. And so the environment presents and precludes certain opportunities. People will adapt to their environment via the material forces, subsistence, technology, social arrangements. And then this will drive all else and shape things in turn, like worldview, all the way up into religion. So there's sort of opposite contrasting approaches. And today I have quite a bit of text on many of the slides for you because we're sort of going through different approaches and building. I don't have much on this slide, so you might want to take some notes just because these are the examples I'm going to give you to illustrate the material approach. And so the key thing is for materialists, they would say people organize around their environment, their resource base, and this leads to different types of subsistence adaptations, like being hunter-gatherers, horticulturalists, farmers, wage workers, teachers, students, whatever. As the way people organize around their resource base changes, other aspects of the society will also change. Okay, so let's take the kung of the Kalahari first. And the exclamation point, that's a glottal stop. So it would be like kung of the Kalahari. They are a hunter-gatherer group, at least traditionally, in Africa, Central Africa, the Kalahari Desert, now Kalahari Game Reserve. They live in an area where resources are somewhat patchy, right? They fluctuate depending on the season, depending on availability, right? There might be more or less water, certain plants growing, certain game animals. And so they live off the land, what the land provides. They're hunter-gatherers. They subsist off wild resources. Because of this subsistence adaptation, and this is true for all hunter-gatherers, except for ones that live on the coast. Don't worry about that. They cannot support large population levels. This type of subsistence can only support low, small, band level populations, anywhere from maybe 25 to 100 people in any particular band. And then there's several bands that are interconnected through marriage or kinship or trade, but they're spread out through the landscape. They live in smaller groups, bands, because resources are patchy, they're unpredictable, and therefore you cannot support large populations with this type of subsistence. They're also nomadic, meaning they move around. They don't have permanent settlements. They move every couple of weeks or couple of months, depending on resource availability. So as resources become depleted or the season changes, they'll move on to another area. Because they're nomadic, they also don't really have a lot of possessions. What you can carry is pretty much what you have because you're moving all the time. Their houses, their huts are made out of thatch and local materials. You might have some weapons, maybe some cloth, some beads, and that's about it, right? Everyone has about the same stuff. If someone else has something that you don't have or more of something, you probably can just ask them for it and they'll probably just give it to you, right? So on that note, they also share a lot. They have what we call an egalitarian social organization. In the US, we live in a stratified society, meaning there's different social classes, and even somewhat of a ranked society where your social class can be inherited. Egalitarian means that everyone's roughly equal to one another in terms of status. It doesn't mean that 6-year-olds should be doing the same tasks as 40-year-old men, right? They recognize differences in age and gender. But other than that, everyone's roughly equal. Men tend to hunt, women tend to gather, but not because they're not allowed to hunt. Actually, does anyone know why women in the Kung, if anyone's familiar with them or other hunter-gatherer groups, they tend to go gathering and not hunting, even though they could go hunting if they wanted? And it's because all these things are interconnected.
Is it because of like birth and childbearing?
Yeah, exactly. So women, they're the ones that get pregnant. They're the ones that carry the child. They're the ones that breastfeed and lactate. And so gathering just tends to be more conducive, right? Can you imagine sort of going out to stalk and hunt a giraffe for 4 days, carrying a small baby that you're still breastfeeding and maybe having another small child tagging along behind you? And so it's just, it's not conducive. So they could, but gathering tends to be more compatible with childcare, and the responsibility for breastfeeding just by definition falls on the females, right? Not the males. So they're egalitarian and they share. It's called generalized reciprocity, meaning I sort of give to you, not really expecting a return at any specific time or of equal value, but I share my gathered foods with you. I share the meat that I got with you, knowing that when I'm empty-handed in a few days or months or whatever, that you're going to share with me, right? And so it's a really adaptive, this egalitarian social organization and the generalized reciprocity, the sharing, it's adaptive in this environment where resources are very patchy and unpredictable, right? So that if you don't have good luck, that's okay. Someone's going to share with you knowing that you're going to do the same for them. And in this way, everyone eats, everyone's needs are met. It's the humanization process that Bodley talks about. Sort of the main driving force in the tribal world is making sure everyone's needs are met. Everyone has food, everyone has access to the resources they need to survive. That's the driving force, the main concern shaping the way the society organizes itself. And as you've been reading about, when we get up to the commercial world, societies like our own, the humanization process has been superseded, right, by sort of for-profit business and commercialization. We'll get to that when we get to it. And so they share. Because sharing is so important among this group in this environment, they have this really interesting social custom that has evolved called insulting the meat. And so what happens is a hunter goes out, and they're very skilled hunters, but because game is so unpredictable, you as a male hunter might be successful in 1 in 4 hunts, right? Not because you're not good, but just because there's not a lot always to catch. And so the hunter, say he goes out for a couple of days, he's been hunting, and he comes back and he's walking up to the edge of the village, and other villagers will sort of run up. And yet this, for those of you that have heard of this, a very famous anthropologist, Richard Lee, wrote an article called Eating Christmas in the Kalahari. And so that's exactly what I'm talking about. He's talking about insulting the meat. And so the hunter comes back, everyone runs up. What'd you get? What'd you get? Because they're excited. They're going to get to eat meat. And the hunter says, nothing. No, come on. You've been gone for like 2 days. What did you get? No, I didn't catch anything. And come on, no. So this goes back and forth for a while, right? Finally, the hunter sort of half smiles, right? And well, maybe I got a small one. Maybe I caught something tiny. And at this point, everyone gets pretty excited because they know that means he's actually bagged something really big, and everyone's going to be eating meat and feasting for several days. And so what they're doing is they're insulting the hunter. They're insulting the catch. And it's a social leveling mechanism to keep people humble, to keep people from bragging or boasting or coming to think of themselves as better or superior to anyone else in the group, which can really threaten the egalitarian sharing nature of the Kung, which is so adaptive in this particular environment. And so the hunter finally kind of, oh, I got something small. Everyone goes out and butchers this huge carcass of whatever they caught. And even as they're shoving the meat and fat in their mouths and smiling and laughing and they're happy, they're, you know, you're a piece of shit, hunter. And why did you drag us out here to cut up this bag of bones? We're all going to go hungry. And they know the hunter is good. They are very excited for the meat, but they keep insulting it endlessly, right? It's a social leveling mechanism, keeps people humble. Reinforces the egalitarian nature of the group. And the Kung, they're not stupid. They're probably smarter than us, but it's not like they don't recognize the difference between a really skilled hunter that is very successful all the time and someone that isn't. They can see that. They're not stupid. The trick is you do not let differences in skill translate into differences in status and differences in access to resources that we all need to survive, right? And so there's differences in skill. They recognize that. The trick is to not let that turn into differences in status and access to resources. Insulting the meat. So a materialist anthropologist explaining Kung culture, all the way from patchy, unpredictable resources in their environment to small band level populations that are egalitarian, to this custom of insulting the meat, right? That reinforces that. Materialist approach. The environment presents and precludes certain opportunities. People adapt to it via the material forces. That will drive other aspects of the system, like population size, social organization, and even ideologies and beliefs or customs like insulting the meat. This article, Eating Christmas in the Kalahari, was written, I think Richard Lee did it in like the late 60s, early 70s. He was an anthropologist that had spent a year or two or more out studying the Kung, and this sort of the traditional Kung, and they did this to him one Christmas. So as an anthropologist, you're there to collect data. It's supposed to be sort of science. And so you can't really give people a bunch of stuff, right, for participating in the research, because it will literally change what they're doing. So Richard Lee was out there to observe what are their hunting patterns like, what's their diet like. And so if he was also simultaneously giving them canned foods and all this other stuff, then he's actually impacting what he's there to study. It's a really shitty, it's uncomfortable, right? Because, well, it's uncomfortable. And so Richard Lee finally sees his chance. Christmas is coming up. They celebrate it. It's a chance to sort of feast and celebrate. And so he buys the biggest, fattest black ox he can find. It's like 1,200 pounds. And they insult him and make fun of him so much and tease him and tell him what a waste of time and why'd he bother buying this skinny sack of bones. All the Kung villagers just, you're a waste of time, Richard, you know, fuck you. And he's so upset, he almost leaves, right? And goes into the bush to spend Christmas eating Christmas in the Kalahari. But he ends up staying, and they butcher the ox he bought, and it was his chance to give back. I've had to be kind of stingy. I haven't really been able to give handouts, and now's my chance to really give back. And so he was excited about it. Well, the Kung did this to him, right? Insulted him endlessly till he almost just gave up. And it was only after they slaughtered the ox, everyone's laughing and feasting and talking about how delicious it is. And he still doesn't understand what's going on. He finally asks his informant. He says, everyone ate the food. Why were they so mean to me? You know, poor Richard. And he said, oh, the villager says that's their custom, right? Because I just explained to you this custom of keeping people from bragging or sort of being big-headed. And so Richard Lee says, well, why didn't you tell me that? And the villager says, you didn't ask, right? So they kind of played a joke on him. That's where that comes from. But it's a classic piece. If anyone's interested, it's like 3 pages. I can send it to you. Let me know. Okay, one more example. Let's talk about the Aztecs, since we're SDSU. Remember, as the way people organize around their resource base changes, other aspects of the culture will also change. So in certain regions around the world, start of the Holocene and agriculture 10,000 years ago, agriculture, farming pops up in several different regions around the world, independently, interestingly, meaning they were coming up with it on their own, they weren't sharing the idea. And one of these places is Mesoamerica, where the Aztecs, still reside. And so agriculture begins here. Now with hunting and gathering, let's say you have an acre of land. With hunting and gathering, there's only so many edible plants and animals on that specific acre of land that you can use. With farming, you've now converted that entire piece of land into edible food for humans because you're growing crops on it, right? So it's not just a portion that you can eat off, you've converted it all to food. The result of this is a food surplus, agricultural surplus. There's way more food being produced in this environment. So you start seeing much larger population sizes, up to the thousands and tens of thousands. You get villages and the first cities and kingdoms. The societies are larger because there's more food to support people. They also become sedentary, no longer nomadic. They're not moving around anymore because they don't need to. Their resources are being produced in one area. They're farming. You're investing time in that land. You're not going to just abandon it, right? So they're now sedentary, much larger populations. And because they're not moving around, they're also now able to accumulate wealth, stuff, right? Not just within their own lifetime, but over several generations. Because farming, in hunting and gathering, everyone in the community is involved in procuring food. In farming, not so. You don't need the entire population engaged in producing food to feed the entire population. You just need a segment of the society farming. In the US, for example, one farmer feeds like 120 people or something. And so this frees up other segments of the population to do other things and do what we call specialization. They start specializing in other types of occupations, whether that's tool making or pottery or craftsmanship or sort of the ruling elite. But people begin to specialize and do different jobs. As they take on these different roles over time, they also gain different statuses, right? Different sort of statuses in society. Part of the ruling class, are you peasant farmer, somewhere in the middle. And so not moving around, larger populations, they're now accumulating wealth, and they're also getting differentiated in status via occupational lines. And over time, what this leads to is inequality, is social stratification, right? These different social classes with differential access to resources and power. In turn, this can lead to further changes in the culture, such as worldviews that reinforce the power dynamic. For example, among the Aztecs, Aztec rulers were considered half gods, half king, half god. They were divine, right? Part supernatural. And that divinity was sort of an implicit promise to the people, right? I'm connected to the supernatural. I'll make sure the crops grow, the rains come. And that's also why the masses were willing to sort of feed, the elite, right? So all the way from the environment, warming with the Holocene, agriculture is now possible. People change the way they change their subsistence. They're now farmers. Leads to larger populations, sedentary, social stratification via specialization, all the way up to the divine right to rule, this worldview to reinforce the power of those that have it, right? So materialist approach. And so here you can sort of see them again. Go ahead, Natalie.
It sounds like, so they're both materialist approach, but they both sound really different.
Yeah, because they're totally different types of adaptations. Good. So materialist is just the general approach. And it says, if you want to understand why this society looks like this, right? Your starting point should be, how have they adapted to the environment, their economy, if you will. And in our country, we think of money when we say economy, but in anthropology, when I say economy, I just mean, how are they making a living? It could involve no money, right? Like hunter-gatherers. And so as that changes, as the environment changes or the way they're adapting to it via the material forces, it leads to all these other changes, right? So we're in the Kalahari, you end up with band level social organization from hunting and gathering. With farming being viable in Mesoamerica, this resulted in other changes, right? So they're totally different types of cultures and societies. But similar approach, using material forces as the focal point to explain what shapes the broader social organization. Does that clarify?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, because they're like totally different examples, but I'm giving you both of the examples in relation to materialist approach. So materialist anthropologists could, and anthropologists don't agree on sort of which approach you should take. Some say this, some say the other. But if you're using a material approach, you would use the same method, the same analytical focus to try to break down any society. So, good.
Sorry. So like for interpretive, it's more like ingrained. It's like cultural. It's more cultural and like your worldview because of like your upbringing or your influences. But yeah, the materialist is more like adaptive, depending on like where you are in those forces.
Yeah, and we're building here, so good. And the materialist approach, sometimes it seems weird for the large, complex society we live in, because is our economy adaptive? And so we'll get into that. And the answer is probably not. But yeah, it's sort of two different starting points. Interpretivist, how does worldview, upbringing, values, how does that drive people's actions? Versus materialists say, no, actually how people meet their needs in their environment, that's most important. And probably why you're kind of going back and forth with it in your head is because they're not mutually exclusive, right? Just because one kind of works doesn't mean the other one doesn't, right? And oftentimes maybe it could be interplay between the two of them, right? Which is kind of where we're headed, actually. Does that help for now?
Yeah.
These are good questions. Yeah.
Thanks.
So just kind of to visualize both approaches, right? The weakness of one is the strength of the other. They're ultimately complementary. So the weakness of the materialist approach, which is focusing on adaptation, material forces, how does that shape everything else? That's right. It doesn't take into account the influence worldview can have, or religion, or values, or new ideas. That's the strength of the interpretive approach, right? They focus on worldview. So the strength of one is the weakness of the other. And ultimately, again, they're not mutually exclusive. Both sort of work. It depends on what group you're looking at and what you're trying to figure out, right? So there's a third approach to human environment relationships, and this is human ecology. So ecology, back in like the 60s, before 1970, ecologists used to study ecosystems as separate entities, like as separate from social systems. You could study the social system or you could study the ecosystem, but not both. And sort of 1970, this change in reaction to this was the development of human ecology, which says you can't study the environment as an isolated system separate from humans. We're literally in the Anthropocene, right? Humans are part of the ecosystem. We're having a major impact on it. So human ecology takes this ecosystems approach, that it's not the social system and the ecosystem, but it's one total interconnected socio-ecological system, right? One system. And it's about feedback between the two, the ecosystem and the social system. So just for example, people affect ecosystems when they use resources like water, fish, timber, livestock grazing land. After they use these materials from ecosystems, people return them to the ecosystem as waste. And people will intentionally modify or reorganize existing ecosystems or create brand new ones to better suit their own needs, right? Whether that's food production or building or whatever it might be. And so in human ecology, it approaches the human environment from the standpoint that everything is connected and interconnected, but it tries to distill down what the most important connections are in the system, which again depends on what exactly you're looking at. And notice how it sort of blends both the materialist and the interpretive approach, right? It kind of brings both in, room for worldview and also for environmental adaptation and economy to shape human actions and therefore impacts on the ecosystem. And it continues on, cycles on. So just a quick simplified example of human ecology is the destruction of marine animals by commercial fishing. And so fishing has been around forever, but large scale commercial fishing where you're catching a huge amount of whatever species for sale on the market, commercial fishing. So fishing is directed at certain species of fish, but often has unintended consequences for other parts of the ecosystem. So in the 1980s, we saw a rise of the use of nylon drift nets. You see a picture on the bottom, just these large nets spread out, either dragged behind the boat or anchored somewhere in the waters. And so the drift nets will catch whatever species you're targeting to sell, but also a bunch of bycatch, meaning unintended things that you're not actually targeting, but come and get caught in the nets anyways. So it was discovered when they started using these nylon drift nets that they were killing large numbers of dolphins, sharks, sea turtles, this bycatch, the stuff that is sort of, the nets are indiscriminate. They catch whatever comes along, not just the species that the fisherman wants. And so turtles, for example, is a major cause of sea turtle deaths. They get caught, they get ensnared in the net, they can't come up for air, and they drown. And so in reaction, this information is passed back to the social system. This is one of the impacts we're having. And so in reaction, conservation groups pressured governments, and eventually the UN passed a resolution banning the use of these nets. Okay, so in reaction to that, fishermen were now forced to switch over to long lines. And long lines, sort of these long fishing lines, either dragged behind a boat or anchored in the water, hundreds of miles of line with thousands and thousands of hooks that have bait strung all along them, stretched out in the waters. And so, and you can sort of see a picture here. Once fishermen started using long lines, it was discovered that this technology was killing a large number of seabirds, right? That basically sort of see that baited hook or what looks to them like their next meal or prey, dive down to get it, get caught on the hook and end up drowning. And so fishermen are now attempting to make modifications to prevent this from happening, so seabirds don't grab the hooks. Things like setting them at night when the birds aren't out, putting streamers on the lines to scare birds away, weighting the lines so that they sink more quickly, not fishing during spawning or birds' reproductive season, stuff like that. The jury is sort of out. But the key point in human ecology is that human activities generate these chain effects that pass back and forth between the social and ecosystem, right? It's about this continuous feedback. Human ecology has a weakness itself. And so while it's done a good job pointing out that the social and ecosystem are interconnected, we really need to look at all the interconnections, not just one or two, but it doesn't really account for power differences among people. So like, for example, if I or one of you versus Bill Gates or Donald Trump, which was an example I used to use before he was president, applied for a land permit or to build something around here, who's going to have a better chance of probably getting that approved or making it happen? And you never know, but probably the people with power, with money, that know people in positions of power. And so the weakness of human ecology, it doesn't really account for how power and powerful people affect humans' interactions with their environment in an unequal way. And what I mean is we don't all receive the same benefits from human environment interactions, from the resources that companies exploit and the food we grow. Not everyone receives the benefits of that, right? Some people live in food deserts where they don't even have access to some of the food they might have helped grow. And so we experience the environment and its advantages differently, unequally. And that's true for the costs too, right? The environmental degradation that can also come from human environment interaction, that's also not distributed equally, right? Those costs fall on certain segments of the population much more than others. So I'll give you an example from my own work. So Solomon Islands, just real quick, this idea of natural disasters. The reason there's quotes around natural disasters is because there's not really such a thing as a natural disaster. So what I mean is the actual physical event, like the tsunami, the earthquake, the wildfire, hurricane, that's what we call a natural hazard. It's a geophysical event, it's a weather event. And think about if something like that happens on a deserted island or in the middle of the ocean and no one's there to see it, or maybe we caught it on our satellite observations, but no one's really affected by it. We don't call that a natural disaster, right? We call it weather or whatever. It's not a natural disaster. And so a true natural disaster only occurs when the hazard, the actual geophysical event, intersects with a socially vulnerable population. Take, for example, an earthquake that strikes, let's just say, I know California is not a good place to use, but let's say like not a high magnitude earthquake. It happens, maybe a little bit of building damage, maybe a few sinkholes open up. San Diego likes to do that. But then say that exact same magnitude earthquake hit Haiti, as it did, right, several years ago, about a decade ago. And they're still trying to come back from that, right? Earthquake hits California. People in the society experience that differently, but a lot of people have insurance, or they have family, or they have a paycheck. They might have a savings account. They might have family somewhere else they can go stay with. And then even if all that fails, we're supposed to have a federal response, disaster mitigation, FEMA. That's what FEMA's supposed to do, come in and help people that are affected by disasters. And so there's all these safety nets, all these sort of backups, this built-in resiliency for when things go wrong, when disaster strikes you, it doesn't mean that it's all over, right? Okay, I might be out of a job, but maybe I have this, or I can borrow from the government. Again, people experience this differently. But in Haiti, there's none of that, right? There's not only probably not savings accounts and there's no building codes, right? A lot of these people that were affected by the earthquake over 10 years ago lived in shanty towns, sort of lean-to buildings or homes that were up near urban areas so that they could go work for wage labor. I mean, they just crumbled. They collapsed when the earthquake came. There's no sort of water or other infrastructure to deal with that. There's definitely not a federalized disaster response. All these other things, right? The point is, it's the social factors, the social context, or vulnerability that determines how individuals and groups are affected by a disaster, and also their ability to recover, right? And so that's what, when I say natural disaster, it's not really natural, right? It's only when the hazard intersects with a vulnerable population that we truly have a natural disaster. And I'll give you just one other example. Anyone remember the hurricane that hit the Bahamas about a year ago? It did. And I saw, you can probably look this up on YouTube. There was a boat headed for the US, I think to Florida, to bring people from the Bahamas to Florida out of the path of the hurricane, right? Maybe saving their lives. And on the boat, this is where the video shows, on the boat, someone gets on the loudspeaker and says, if you don't have a US passport or a visa or whatever, you cannot come. You have to get off the boat. And I mean, these people are literally evacuating from a hurricane zone that's about to strike, and it wiped them out. It did. And if you don't have a US passport, You don't get to come on this boat to get out of the hurricane. And then you can see on the video women from the Bahamas getting off the boat with little infants in their arms, going back out into the hurricane. And so that's what we mean when we say social factors, social vulnerability, that will determine the impact and the ability to recover from a disaster, right? So just real quick, in terms of my work in the Solomon Islands, as I mentioned, tsunami and large-scale earthquake hit there in 2007, and I went out to research recovery afterwards. The 2 villages I worked in, Titiana, Pailange, pretty much wiped out, similar physical impact, but very different recovery. Titiana's recovery really hindered, very slow, didn't receive a lot of help. And so I was looking at what social factors shaped this outcome. And sort of 2 main ones, you know, first of all, the political organization, the Solomon Islands government, kept a lot of the aid money that came into the country. Corruption, misuse, misappropriated, just gone. It never went to the victims. On top of that, again, the remaining aid tended to be distributed along this thing called the one-talk system. Your one-talks, your relatives, people that speak your language. In the one-talk system here, people will share with and help their own one-talks or relatives before helping other more distantly related people. So when the aid was distributed, it tended to flow along these social exchange networks, these one-talk networks, regardless of how severely people were impacted by the tsunami. So some places got a ton of aid, even though they weren't really affected. Other places like Titiana received almost nothing, even though that was one of the worst impacts. There's this really biased aid distribution related to this pre-capitalist cultural system that no one knew was operating there. All these NGOs, all these people pouring money and time and resources that a lot of them didn't really go anywhere because they don't take the time to understand the culture they're actually working in. So just on the slide, the picture on the top, that was a house that was rebuilt by Oxfam for a pretty vulnerable individual actually in that community. But if you look at the bottom, Sam, those posts behind him, that was the aid he received from Oxfam. After his whole house, everything gone. And some people lost small children, lost their parents, their family died. And that's what he got. He got like 6 wooden posts to build part of a frame. And the posts, you see the house isn't finished. His house is actually next to that. He rebuilt it on his own with his own supplies because the supplies the NGO Oxfam gave him were rotten. The wood was rotten. You couldn't actually use it to build your house. That's why you see that just partially finished structure, right? So some got lots, some got very little. And it's the social and cultural factors that determined that. And so social factors influence how we experience our environment, whether that's through a natural disaster or resource use or pollution. Social factors influence how we experience that very differently, right? Some seeing many benefits, some bearing most of the costs. Political ecology. Okay, so Bodley's approach that we've been reading about could be characterized as political ecology. I just don't even worry about this slide. It's jargony, and what I want you to take away from it is Bodley focuses on power. How does those that have the power and control over decision making, how does that play out, right? How are the risks and the benefits distributed?